Do a review in Likutei Sichos in Chelik Chof Hey, volume 25, and this is the first Sicha for the portion of Vayeitzei. It's a very intricate Sicha, and the Rebbe explains a very fine difference between what the Rambam says and seemingly what the Alter Rebbe says. But the Rebbe, after analysis, points to the differences and also explains what they're about. This is with regards to the laws of a person who's a hired worker, and we learn from the Parsha about what Yaakov said, how he worked. He was hired by Lavan, and we learned the devotion and the how careful you have to be to really fulfill your obligation and to the master. And the Rebbe talks about that there is actually two parts. One is in time to make sure to give all the time that agreed upon, and also to work with all of your energy. And the Rebbe is going to discuss whether these are a separate, there's one obligation, which is the time, and another obligation, which is the energy. And as the Rebbe will explain, we'll learn the Sikha in loving memory of our son, Harav Levi Yitzchak. And this should be to benefit his soul, to Heinish Mosei Tzrura B'Tzrei Chaim. And we'll go step by step. Aleph. Soif Hilchos Schiris, Paskan the Rambam. In the end of the laws of hiring uh, workers, Paskan the Rambam rules, Kederech shemuzhar bal habayis, shelo yigzol schar oni, v'lo yakveno, just as we have a warning, the Torah warns the owner not to steal the pay that you have to pay the poor person, the one who's working, and not to delay it, v'lo yakvenu, not to delay it. Kach, likewise, ha'oni muzhar shelo yigzal meleches balabayis. Likewise, the poor person, the worker, has been warned uh, not to steal from the job that you're doing for the owner. V'yivatel ma'at bekan u'ma'at bekan, and you're going to waste a little time here, a little time here. Umoitzi kol hayom b'mirma, so you will spend the whole day with deceit, not really to do the full work for the day. The worker is not allowed to do that. He's been warned not to do that. Elochayiv ledagdik al atzme bizman. You have to be very meticulously on yourself to for the time, to put in the time that you have to work. And then further, the Rambam writes, that's as far as time goes. And then he says, "V'chein chayiv lavid b'chol koicha." You're also obligated to work with all of your strength. And the proof of it is Shara Yaakov Atzadik Omar, because Yaakov the righteous, or the tzaddik, Yaakov the tzaddik said, Ki b'chol koichi avaditi es avichem, I've served your father with all my heart. He was saying it to his wives, the daughters of Lavan. And he was telling them, I worked with all my strength. That means that you have to, when you work, not only time, but also with all your koyach, lefikoch, and therefore, not al schar zois av ba'olam hazeh, he took the reward for this also in this world. not only in the world to come for being honest, but in this world. Shenemar, Vayifritz Ish Moed Moed, the man burst out very, very much. This is the language of the Rambam. And we'll see the Rebbe explains there's a lot of nuances in the Rambam, how the Rambam writes this. Everything will be explained later on in the Sicha, every word and the precise wording of it and what the Rambam means over here. But for now, the Rambam just says you have to be careful in time and you also have to work with all your might. And this is proved from Yaakov, what he said, how he served Lavan, and that he got paid even in this world, the fact that he burst out Moed Moed. Then the Rebbe brings down the Alter Rebbe, which seems almost precise like the language of the Rambam, with some small changes. Very difficult to decipher that there's any difference over here. Der Rebbe, der Monter Din, werd euch herabgebracht in Shulchan Aruch von Alten Rebbe. The above halacha is also brought down in the code of law of the Alter Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. And this is the language. Just as the owner is warned not to steal from the pay of the poor person working, of the worker, and also not to delay it. So likewise, the poor person has been warned not to waste the work, not to neglect the work of the balabais. He'll waste time here a little here there. And he will go through the entire day with deceit. But he has to be medagdik on himself in time. So that's as far as time goes, but he also has to work with all of his might. Shahar Yaakov Atzadik Omar, because Yaakov the Tzadik said, Kimchol koichi obaditi esavicham. Same proof from Yaakov, I worked with all my strength, he told his wives that he served Lavan. He took his pay also in this world, as it says, it almost seems identical, the language of the Alter Rebbe, with very small minor changes to the Lashon of the Rambam. But the Rebbe will point to the continuation of the Rambam, of the Alter Rebbe, and the Rebbe will compare that in the order of things, the following halachas in the Rambam that follow this halacha of the Alter Rebbe, those halachas that the Alter Rebbe follows this halacha in the same sif actually come in the Rambam before the Rambam. So basically, the order is different in the Rambam and the order in the Alter Rebbe. In the next halacha, we have so far what we learned, this seems identical, almost. With the Rebbe later on going to point out some minor changes which will fit the other idea. But the main issue the Rebbe is going to address now is the other halacha, not yet mentioned over here, as the Rebbe will continue to develop this idea to see what other halachas we actually learn from this as the Rebbe continues. Bashkofa Rishona, at first glance, Zetois, it appears, as the Alter Rebbe is blois maitik Lashon Rambam. The Alter Rebbe is merely quoting and copying from the Rambam, mit shinuyim kalim, very light changes. Aber kaddaikes shapir, but when you really pay good attention and you look into it the details. Zetman Ashinu Ikri B'Shulchan Aruch Ad Merazokin. We see a major change in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch from what it says in the Rambam. Not in the above quoted piece, but in the next piece. Noch bringen den Limud for Yaakov after the Alter Rebbe brings the lesson from Yaakov B'chol Koichi. Is the Alter Rebbe Mamshech. The Alter Rebbe therefore continues. Lefikov, because of having to serve your master with all your koyach, Eina poil rashoy lasis malacha balaylo ulaskir atzme bayom. A worker is not permitted to do work at nighttime and then hire himself out during the daytime. Because, of course, he's going to be exhausted. He's not going to be able to work with Chol Koicha. And person is not permitted to do work using his animals during the nighttime, and then go rent it out during the daytime to somebody else. The animal is tired, won't be able to do the work. And a worker is not permitted to starve himself or to afflict himself, because that would cause a weakening of his power. And he will not be able to do the work of the master with strength. So this following the halacha that the Alter Rebbe said that you have to work b'chol koichei, he brings the following halachas that because of that you're actually not allowed to do work at nighttime, so that you can't hire. Then you won't be able to work at daytime. Same thing is with the animal. Do with it work for yourself at the nighttime and then hire it out for the daytime or to be hungry, because you have to work b'chol koicha. That's a result of the halacha. However, in Rambam, these halachas don't come as a consequence because you have to work b'chol koicha. In the Rambam, di dinim of eina poil rashoyi, but he says you're not allowed to, werden gebracht euch in Rambam. They're brought in the Rambam. Aber dort kommen sie in der frierdike halacha. Over there they come in a previous halacha. Eider sagt kederach shemuzer balabayis shelo yigzol. Before this whole piece that the Rambam says that you have to be careful and you have to work b'chol koiche, this whole halacha, the Rambam says you're not allowed to do work at nighttime and all these halachas that brought down that we just quoted from the Alter Rebbe. So the order makes a big difference. So that is a difference in order, which tells us that there is something different over here. That the Rambam has a little bit, the Alter Rebbe deviates from the interpretation of the Rambam, and this is going to be the explanation of the Sikha. Now, one can argue, don't make such a big to-do about the change of the order, because, okay, he wrote like this, he wrote like that, the order. And maybe in the Rambam, which is just halachas, in order what happens, so he starts off with the order, a sequence of the night and the day. First, what takes place before the day's work, and then he talks about the day's work. That's the order in the Rambam. But in the Alter Rebbe, who gives the reasoning for things, so maybe first he tells you that you have to use b'chol koichai, and that's why this is a consequence of that. So maybe the order is not really so much. The Rambam follows the order of the day. Let's look inside. You could say that this order is not really as the shinui. It doesn't change anything in the contents. Nor blois b'seder advorim. It's only in the order how these matters are presented, behesem, fitting zum chiluk from Sefer HaRambam Shulchan Aruch Ad Merazokim as fitting to the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam hat geschrieben Sifrei Halachas Halacha. The Rambam writes just halachas. Beli time halachas. He doesn't have the reasoned halachas. He doesn't have to have the reason before he gives you the halacha because he doesn't give reasons. So he writes just the halachas. Mashenke the Alter Rebbe hat geschrieben Shulchanei halachas b'taimem davke. He wrote the halachas with the reasonings. So in the Alter Rebbe, before he gives halacha, has to give the reason. The Rambam doesn't give no reason, and therefore, in the Rambam und der Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe stellt euch the halachas in an Eifun, was gibt da ruis dem Tam und Hagdore von the halachas. The Alter Rebbe sets up the order. He gives the reason and he defines the halachas. Und der Freier bringt no die alle Dinim in demselben Sif. That's why he brings all these halachas in the same Sif. Noch der Agdoma Klolis, ulikulon. And after the general introduction, and for everything, this is the rule for all the following halachas in this Sif. Just as the owner has been warned not to cheat the worker, the poor person, likewise the worker, the poor person, Muzor is warned, not to waste the work you need to do for the balabais. But those is together from the aladim. This is the find of all these halachas that follow of not working at the day. Everything that Rambam, that Alter Rebbe follows. And in them gufa, and in this itself, stelter frier die azhore. So first he places the warning v'chiyuv l'dagdik al atzmei bisman. So first he says, as a consequence of taking care of the work that you do for the balabais, first we write that you have to be careful time-wise, and also v'chein l'chayev labed b'chol koicha, you have to work with all your strength, time and force. Und then follows the Isur HaMisuvav Mizeh, the prohibition, which is a consequence, was kum der fun arois, euch benegeh des man amalocha, which also has a consequence when the time of work, that you're ein apoil, las malach b'layla v'chulu, because you're not allowed to do the work, because then you won't be able to do what you're supposed to do, work properly. So first of all, this is the order of things in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. In the Rambam. So by the Alter Rebbe, it's all a result of the working honestly in time, working honestly with force, and therefore you can't do anything to hamper that by working the night before or renting out your animal, as the halacha is. As opposed to, that's why this is the order in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, because the reasoning is the basis for all these halachas. Mashenk in the Rambam is negebi kararis geben them psak halacha. The Rambam is mainly what's important is to give the ruling of the halacha. Und der Pfarrer stellt ois the halachas leiten seder azman, and that's why he sets up the halachas according to the order of the time. Frier dem Isur, der Isur was kommt, koidem zman hamlocha bepoil. First he says the prohibition that comes before the time. That's the sequence, that the order. First we do what's not allowed to do even before you start doing the work. Ein apoil rashoy. And unerst the noch the azhores belchekumen bizman hamlocha, that they come in time of locha gufa, when you're doing the work. So this first he talks about what takes place before doing the work, and then the chayiv l'dagdil atzm bisman v'chein chayiv labed b'chol koicher. So therefore, that's what I'm. So it's pretty simple. It's not. There's nothing special to learn from this. Besides that, the Rebbe says v'noisuf lazer the dinim ein hapoyel Rashoyi chulu zayin hemshech to the yonim mirma l'chayra v'chapel megyeton, was the Rambam zogt fardim. So the Rambam before the writes that there's certain things that he is allowed to do, items of deceit that is permitted for the worker to do. He says, they're allowed to dip their bread in tzir, so that's okay to take more of the balabayis dipping it in and take more time to eat it as just eating plain bread. One of them is the Rambam Meister Mamshech Avo, Ein HaPoil Rashoichul, but he's not allowed, so that's fizzed. Aber das ist nicht kein Bir Maspik, wenn nicht in the Dan. That's not a sufficient explanation in our case. Warum von dem was der Rambam häupt on the letzte Aloche mit Hagdoma. Fact that the Rambam starts it with an introduction. כדרך שמוזר בלבאי שלא יקבז על שכר עוני חולו ככה עוני מוזר שלא יגזל מלאכס בלבאיס. He says, just like the balabais is warned not to steal, so the poor person is not allowed to steal from the balabais. Afal pivos that Amoche Klor gesagt in the Friedrich Halacha, even though he already said in the previous Halacha, as a Stornit Zain Gezel Malachte Shal Balabais, you're not allowed to steal the Balabais. He's already said that before. And the Rambam starts because the Rambam says you can't, you have to work properly. Is Muchach, Ados is nit Nora Isof Mitzad Shinu in the Mzman Maiso Isur. It's not just an addition because there's a change in the time and the Isur that this is taking place Shas Mlocha, that's before the Mlocha. Nor sees Abzunder Geder, but it's a different, has another definition over here. And there's difference between the Rambam in the Alter Rebbe as far as the definition is. So the Rebbe explains, das heißt, this means, Leuten Alten Rebbe, according to the Alter Rebbe, as the dinim eina poil rashoi, the laws that the worker is not permitted to hire himself by night and then again by day, kumen tekev behemshech yoshor zum chiyu lavu b'chol koichei. They come immediately as a follow-up to the halacha, to the obligation to work b'chol koichei. And therefore, lifikoch ein hapoil rashoi chului. And that's why he's not allowed to. So it's all based on the obligation to work b'chol koichei. Kumtois, ados is a mesubov, that this is a result from the mchiyu lavid b'chol koichei, from the obligation to work b'chol koichei. And because of that, the poil is not allowed to. Mashenkin, like the Rambam, as opposed to the Rambam, that's not a result of b'chol koichei that you're not allowed to hire yourself out. But he says this in the previous halacha. So it's a separate halacha and an isur by himself. First of all, you're not allowed to hire yourself up. And then there's another chiv that you have to work b'chol koichei. So the Alter Rebbe didn't make this up. If it's not in the Rambam, the Alter Rebbe uses this as a result of the din of b'chol koichei. But in the Rambam, it's in the previous halacha, the Alter Rebbe is mused on this smag. This idea, as it's recorded and it's brought down in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, as the prote dinim ein hapoil rashoy chulu, that these specific halachas of ein hapoil rashoy seinen verbunden mit dem chiyuv lavid b'chol koiche, with the obligation to work with all of your might. Was man lernt up from Yaakov, which we learn from Yaakov, is mafurish smag. That's in Sefer Mitzvos Godel. Over there, it says that this is the reason why ein hapoil rashoy, why is he not allowed to hire himself out, etc., because of the obligation of Chol Koiche. Okay, so the Alter Rebbe has a source of it, but we need to look in an explanation. What is the hasbore in the Tzei Shita? So what's the explanation of these two views? Whether these above dinim that you're not allowed to hire yourself at night and day is a result of the obligation because you have to work b'chol koicha and therefore you're not allowed to hire yourself out, or that adin b'fnei asma, or like in the Rambam, which comes before it's its own din. Gimel. So first the Rebbe is going to analyze the wording in the Rambam. It's also, some of it is in the Alter Rebbe's, same quote. It seems a little bit, several parts which seem a little hard to understand the way the Rambam writes it. But das Verstehen beHagdim Habir in the Limud Anal Rambam from Yaakovin as how the Rambam learns this from Yaakov. So it says, "V'chein chayiv lavid b'chol koicha," and likewise you're obligated to serve with all your power. And he says, "Shaharei Yaakov at Tzadik Omar," because Yaakov, the Tzadik, says, "Ki b'chol koichi avaditi esavicha." I worked for him with all my koyach. And then it says, "Lefikach notal schar zois abolim hazeh." He took this schar also of working hard. He took it also abolim hazeh. Shneimar vayifresh haish moed moed, that he burst out very much. This was schar in olam hazeh. The l'cheira is in them nit verstandig, because it would seem on the surface this is not understood. Aleph. The Rambam is doch kenal a sefer von halachas halacha. The Rambam is a book of laws. Vos is negei la halacha der siyum. What is it important? The halacha, the end. Lefikach notal schar zois av ba'olam hazeh, that he took the schar zois also the chulu. Why is it? What kind of halacha? Why do we need to know that? Now, maybe Taket, this is not because the Rambam wants to say halacha. Maybe it's because the Rambam wants to conclude with something positive. He's finishing off the laws of Sichos, so he brings this down. But as the Rambam schreibt das nur, that the only reason he writes it is kidei l'sayim hilchos Sichos b'davar tov, to conclude the laws of Sichos with something positive. But that's hard to say. Was the Rambam is nit alle pegim halachas she'b'sefer hayad. Not all of his 83 halachas, which is all the halachas in the Yad HaChazokim, Messiah Medover Tov, he always concludes it with something good. That's not. So why would we say that this is to be Messiah Medover Tov? Is Oidvike, the Loshen werd daarop gebracht, euch in Tur v'Shulchan Aruch, loi besim halachas elu. This is brought down in the Tur and Shulchan Aruch, not at the end of these halachas. It's a simon that adds something to the halacha. Nochmer. In Shulchan Aruch Admar Azokin kommt das mit Nasif. Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, this comes in the middle of the Sif. So, first of all, what does he have to say then? Besides the point, the Rebbe asks, number two, it actually contradicts or weakens what you're saying before. If you're saying that there's an obligation to work b'chol koichai, and then you're saying Yaakov worked b'chol koichai, and that's why he got the reward. So if a person doesn't want the reward, he doesn't have to work b'chol koichai. Here, the Rambam is trying to tell you that you have to work. It's an obligation because Yaakov worked like that. And then you say, oh, that he took the schar because of that, meaning it's like an extra. He didn't really have to do base. Nochmer. Der mit is the Rambam sich l'chayre says it seems like he's contradicting himself within himself. Früher bringt der Reihe von Yaakov und Shara Yaakov at Tzadik Omar. First, he brings a proof from Yaakov the Tzaddik that he said, I worked with all my koyach. As is achiyuv, if a poyel lavid b'chol koychoi, that it's an obligation. A worker has to work with all his koyach. Okay, and you say, Yaakov did that. That's an obligation. Oh, but we're saying, okay, that's why he got this the reward in this world. Chulu is a lechere mevatel, so he negates machlish akol upon him, or minimally he weakens the evidence. Because when you're saying that he took the reward, when does break tarois, that sort of brings out, expresses this is not given achiv. It wasn't an obligation. Nor an hoga. This was a conduct of tzidkus miyuchedes. It was a special righteousness by Yaakov, was to them is chorem miyuchet. That's why he got a special award. Not schar zois abolam hazeh. He took the schar for this also in this world. It sort of weakens and takes away the impact of saying, no, you have to, because this is what Yaakov did. And then you say, no, that's why he merited extra. So seems to take away from that. Gimel, was is loshen shaharei? Why does it say shaharei to bring the unit b'lashoin harogel yoser shenemar or k'moshe nemar vayeitzei? Mostly you would use as the pasuk says or k'moshe nemar. Similar to that. Why do we say shaharei? Seems a little strange. In the Rebbe's explanation, all this will be beautifully explained. Dalit. Also, the Lashon HaTzadik, but it's not kin Lashon HaRogel. The Lashon HaTzadik is not the usual als Torah to describing in Rambam. Mostly, instead of saying just Yaakov, you could have said, at most, you should have said, L'shoin HaRogel, Yaakov Avinu. Ubefrat, it would seem, as the Shvacht of the Raya, this takes away from the evidence. Because you're describing who did it, Yaakov the Tzaddik. But those weiß das is an Hogim Yecheres von Yaakov Tzaddik. That points that this is Yaakov the Tzaddik did that. So how would we learn from this for everybody? So why does the Rambam say the Lashon Yaakov Tzaddik? The Rebbe wants to try to say, perhaps we can say a reason for all these languages. The Rebbe wants to explain, but the Rebbe doesn't accept it. The Rebbe wants to say that B'chlav, we have a rule that we don't learn from what happened before Matan Torah. We can say, as midi'ala l'shoinus hanal, the old languages that we just mentioned, is the Rambam oisen tzvavorne de shaila. What the Rambam is trying to answer the question. We don't learn from before Matan Torah. Is wie kemen oplan na halacha in Hilchos Sichos von an Hoges Yaakov lifnei Matan Torah? How could we learn a law in the laws of Sichos from something which Yaakov did before Matan Torah? So, deriben, because of this, we can explain now all the different languages to answer this question. Zogt nit der Rambam ki l'shoin harogel b'chlal ba'araya. It doesn't say the normal language when he brings evidence. Shenemar ki Vayeitzei, weil men lernt es taken nit up from Yaakov. Because we don't learn it from Yaakov, it's not Shenemar, because we can't learn from that pasuk. She's nor ki enas machta. This is just sort of a leaning. We find it to lean on this, but this is not evidence. It's just revealing this matter similar. In order to bring out, to express the importance, how great it is, Yaakov Tzaddik said, I served with all my koyach. That's why he took the schar zois in elam hazeh. So that would be a possibility, maybe, why he brings on Yaakov, the tzaddik, and just not evidence, just to show it's taka did beyond the level of the law, but we're not learning from, we're just bringing out something that we find this idea of working b'chol koichem. But this is very difficult to say that's the reason. Warum gefindt bekam mekoymes euch in the Rambam in the halachas lifnei zeh. We find in many places, also in the laws that precede this, as we learn top halachas from koydem Matan Torah, that we learn halachas from what took place before Matan Torah. V'mizetes b'shayches leparshasenu gufa. With regards to our parsha, we see as the Rambam learned top the halacha. The Rambam learns halacha as afilu b'chayla shel moed ein noisim noshim, that even l'chayla moed we won't do marriages. Why don't you get married in Ashur? Because it's Simchas Yontif, is on Cholamoyed, even not for sure on Yontif, but also the Simcha of Cholamoyed can't marry because you don't want to mix the Simcha of the marriage with the Simcha of Yontif. What do we learn? Fill this week when he married first Leah, and then we'll give you, after the week, we'll give you Rachel, because you can't mix the two together. It has to wait for the week. Uns ist nicht kein Stire zum Klau. So how is that not conflict? Well, how could you learn from Ein Lemeidim Koydem Matan Torah that we don't learn from Koydem Matan Torah? There are several answers and various different answers and different definition. Thereby in the Farshim that the Farshim explain how we can learn it. Upshito benidin dedan. And it's obvious in our case, when we're just trying to learn the Lashon, the Chiyuv of Schiras, but also not din proti, it's not the specific halacha, nor an haga klolis. It's a general conduct, how one needs to be working. This is the way, the pathway, the custom of how work of done. Alpi his dabrus v'heskim adodi b'nei odom. Those are agreement, consultation, and agreement of people agree with each other how to go ahead, and that's the way we do the laws of Schiras. That for sure you can learn before Matan Torah. To point to how people negotiate and how a deal works, so we learn from there. Nochmer, mein Gefin ben Yonenu Gufo Avedis Yaakov Luloven. We find in this area itself, in this level of Avodah B'chol Kochi, that the work of Yaakov, I'm learned from Yaakov. You do learn it from Yaakov. The Gemara sagt, Ad Moshe Shemer Socher Chayv Lishmir. To what extent does a guard who gets paid obligated to guard? Ad Kidei Hayosi, to the extent Kidei Hayisi Bayoyim Achalani Chayrim B'kerech Balaylo. This is what Yaakov said. At the daytime, I was eaten by the heat, and at nighttime by the frost. And that's an obligation for Shemer Socher. So you see, we do learn it from Yaakov's Avodah. So why can't we learn from Yaakov's Avodah over here? So we have a problem. Why does he not say Shenemar? Why does it say Yaakov HaTzadik? Why is the Rambam softening and saying all the less? It's in. What does Bichlal have to say that he took the schar? All the questions the Rebbe asks. And the Rebbe will begin now in his Dalet explaining beautifully exactly what the Rambam intends is over here, as the Rebbe continues to explain. His Dalet. So the Rebbe will explain later on in Nois Vov the chiluk between the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam, that there is a difference between to working bekoyach or bechol koichi. The Rambam starts off and he says that the person has to work bekoyach, and then in a separate halacha that it has to be bechol koichi. According to the Alter Rebbe, as the Rebbe will explain, there is no difference between all of it is part of what we learn out from Yaakov Avinu, but from Yaakov HaTzadik. But we'll leave that. The Rebbe will address this later. Right now, the Rebbe is explaining what is the Rambam coming to tell us, and this is really the Alter Rebbe too. What is the Rebbe asked the various Lashonas, the Hatzadik, and doesn't say Shenemar. What is really going on over here? The Rebbe says that we're trying to tell you that while we understand that you have to put in the full time, if you're going to waste time, that's stealing for the balabais, if the worker is not doing full time. But maybe the obligation to work for the master, put in all your koyach in there, maybe that's an extra obligation. That's not an obligation that if you don't do that, you're stealing from the balabais. Maybe that's just, not a trustworthy. Maybe the Eibishter will pay you back for being an honest worker. So there's stealing time is obvious. You're not doing the job properly. Then it's ben odom l'chaveru, you're stealing the person. But maybe the obligation to work fully b'chol koyach, that's a responsibility for the person, for Hashem, to know whether I'm doing the job right, if I'm being an honor doing the job or not. And maybe the Eibishter will pay me for that in my boy if I do it right. And that's what the Rambam is coming to reject. And that's what the Rambam is learning from Yaakov. Not the fact that he did B'chol Koichi. That's not evidence, as the Rebbe said. Maybe Yaakov was special. But is Yaakov had tzaddik? And the Rebbe explains tzaddik means they did the right thing. It's not Yaakov a chosid. It's not Yaakov. It's tzaddik means the right thing in the context of the Rambam. Tzaddik means doing the right things. He got a reward b'olam hazeh because this was part of the deal. This is not an extra something that you're Vayeitzei of the Shemayim. Let's look inside. The Rebbe explains this first in the words in the Rambam, and of course, the same thing is in the Alter Rebbe, explaining to us the language over here and some of the questions the Rebbe asked. So we can say the explanation. What does he want? What is the proof over here that the Rambam brings? Bring the Rambam arois dem geder hachiyuv lavet b'chol koichai. He's expressing over here, he's bringing out what is the definition of the obligation to work with all your koyach. What is it? Is it only something which you need to do extra to Hashem? Or this is really part and parcel of your obligation to the other person? Frier zog the Rambam. First, the Rambam says, "Kederech shemuzar bal habayis shelo yigzal schar oni." Just like the bal habayis has been cautioned, warned not to cheat, not to rob the pay of the poor person, the worker. Likewise, the poor person has been warned not to rob and steal from the work that he's supposed to do for the owner. This waste a little time here, a little there. Will take out all day with the seed. He has to be careful bisman. This chulu, that's obviously not putting in the full time, not putting in the full day. The time you'd be stealing from your balabais. Lo yigzel melechas balabais. However, the Rambam adds, v'chein chayv lavet b'chol koichai. You also have to work b'chol koichai. Now here, this new obligation that we're saying you have to work all your prun. Maybe you're going to say this is an extra obligation for Hashem. That's to being honest to Hashem. It's not stealing from the other person. The Rambam wants to clarify this. And the Rambam brings from Avram Avinu that he got the reward and this was part of the pay. This was the agreement. Vote men l'choyreg, you can't learn. And you could have learned, thought, der chiv l'dagdeg alasm bisman is verbunden mit shelo yigzom leches balabais. The obligation not to steal from the work of the balabais, not to steal, that includes time, wasting the time. Aber if you steal time, you don't work, you're stealing the balabas, the work you're doing. But this the obligation to work with all of your koyach is nicht verbunden if so viel mit melechas balabais. That is not so connected with the work to the extent we're going to say if you don't do it, you're stealing. If you're not going to work fully, then you're not going to be fulfilling not to steal the balabais because you're not working fully. No. You're not working fully, you're not working with all your koyach, but you're still not stealing from it. So what's the reason that you have to work with koyach? This is something that has to do with the person. As a person, from Yid, you need to do things fully. From Poyel Ha'ovet. The worker that is working, the worker, mit seinen Emunus, his trustworthiness. As darf sich übergegeben zu an Arbeit, he must devote himself to the work, bis lavet b'chol koichai, to serve with all of his power. What that means is, it's not so much that you owe it to the owner. You're not stealing him if you're not doing it b'chol koichei, but it's to Hashem. Das heißt, das ist nicht azoi mitzad dem Geder von ben Odom lachavere zwischen dem Poil mit dem Balabais. It is not so much between what is between you and your friend, between the worker with the owner, which is interpersonal, what you promise to work. No, this is me'ain from benodon l'mokim. This is similar, somewhat of between you and Hashem. If you accepted a job, you got to do it fully. So that's why the Rambam brings the proof. Not the proof that he worked b'chol koiche. Maybe he did it. That's not a proof. He brings the proof that. And the Rebbe asked before, what does he say? He said b'chol koiche, and he got the schar ba'olam hazeh to say this was the reward for the work what he did, and he was supposed to do that because this is part of the obligation. So you're doing b'chol koiche is part of what you're getting paid for, and it's ben odom l'chavere. And then bring the Rambam the Raya. This the Rambam brings the evidence. Shari Yaakov Tzadik Omar. Yaakov the Tzadik says, "Ki b'chol koichi avadete esavichem lefikach notl schar zois." Ba'olam hazeh, he took it ba'olam hazeh. The Rambam is trying to say this is the ba'olam hazeh. This is the interpersonal. This is your obligation. Shenema v'ivretz ish moed moed. Not to say as somehow he got extra reward for it. The Raya is not nor from Ascholas Dvorov was Yaakov Omar Kibchol Kechavat Zavichem. It's not only from the beginning of Yaakov's words that he says, I worked him as a simon, that you have to work with all your proof. On the contrary, that doesn't prove anything. In der Wort man gekannt sagen, here, if just Bechol Koichi, you could say, as Yaakov did mitmatisch when Yaakov emphasized as he acted beyond the letter of the law, of the row of the law. I mean, he did go and beyond. It's not a proof that you have to do b'chol koichi. Maybe he was not obligated to serve b'chol koichi. Und dann ist doch das a Reihe listed. So then you're bringing this evidence here. You're saying that this is part of stealing your friend when you're not working b'chol koichi, as is nitoach chiyuv if you hadn't poil b'chol koichi. So this would say you're not obligated to work b'chol koichi because Yaakov is showing you, I did lefnim reshus hadin. The proof is not b'chol koichi, nor the ikeraya, the main evidence what the Rambam wants to bring the raya, that this would be gzela, is from them hemshech halosh, lefikach not al schar zois. This wasn't lifnim mishur sadin. It was an obligation. He took this chulu. He took this as payment. The oif to them is here. What's accomplishment over here is nit azoy as Yaakov bakum and aschar from the Eibishter. It's not that Yaakov got a reward for Hashem. Parmekayim zaynat tziva Hashem. He did the Eibishter's tzivui. He worked fully. He was a trustworthy worker. Und bei anderen Mitzvahs kann das sein, Aschar nor ba'olam habo. In other mitzvahs, they might only get him habo. And here, Yaakov got extra. This saying ba'olam hazeh is an extra. No, just the opposite. Olam hazeh shows that this is the obligation. Isn't it? Abakat tziva Hashem bei anderen Mitzvahs kann das sein, Aschar nor ba'olam habo. You can only get ba'olam habo. He got extra. Nor, it's just verkehrt. As erod bakum and schar zois. This was the pay for his obligation work. The schar of sein melocha. This is the schar zois for doing, not for doing extra, not for getting it now. This is what he got paid for doing because this is the obligation. This haste. The nok was schor chovos loven not abgeret mit Yaakov. When he told him, give your price, that Lavan made up with Yaakov, hot lepoil gebrach derzu, that brought for this, as chot Lavan not him gewollt amna, even though Lavan wished to cheat him, trick him, von deswegen, the bald as bechol koichi goimer, is since I worked with all my power, I did my obligation that I'm supposed to. I work b'chol kochi. Vayeitzei ish moed moed. Aschar behesem mit seiner Arbeit. I got paid for fitting my work. Was is given in an Eifel from b'chol kochi gavadati. I worked with all my koyach and I get the schar zois for that. So the full statement. So from this you understand what the Rambam is trying to tell you. The reward for b'chol kochi is associated not to steal. This is your obligation. As the Lavet b'chol kochi is verbunden nicht nur mit Gabra. It's not just a responsibility for the person. You need to do it, but the work is done regardless. Mitten poil kshula atzmei, with the worker for himself, that he needs to know that he has to be an honest worker. But mit malachte lebalabais, this is the work for the balabais. Was the far at Yaakov bakumen euch far dem sein schar be'el mazeh. That's why he got the reward in this world. And because it's not extra for something. This is actually trying to tell, that Rambam wants to tell you that this is actually the obligation, and that's why you get paid in this world, schar zois, and you get it by the mazeh. The Rambam and the Alter Rebbe too uses the same lashon, because what's intended over here in the Rambam to say that working b'chol koiche is not something different than working b'chol zman, which is obviously stealing. This is also part of your obligation to the person who hired you to work b'chol koiche. This is not an extra. And that's why he brings this proof not from b'chol koiche, but from the hemshech haloshim, b'chol koiche and schar zois, and this was payment. Why? Because this is an obligation to his boss to love him, and that's why he got this, and he couldn't trick him because he needed to get what he deserved, because b'chol koicha you get, that's part of the payment, and he had to get the payment, and this was the payment, and he got this payment because he did his obligation, not that this was extra for him. And this explains the diukim. Hey, v'abizeh yumtaku di tzvei diukim anal in Lashon Rambam. And this will sweeten these two questions. Why doesn't it say shenemar? Aleph, sagt nicht shenemar, nor sheharei. For why? Weil die Reihe ist nicht nur von dem Posik, ki b'chol koicha avadet es avichem. It's not a shenemar because this Posik says I worked. No. That pasuk, as the Rebbe said, would not be necessarily a proof. Maybe it did mefnimishus it. Nor oichu be'iker, but also mainly from the ganzen weiterdicke hemshach. That was the hemshach lefikach notel schar zois, and that's why vayifretzish moed moed is a siman that this is your obligation, because that's why he got his payment over here be'olam hazeh. So it's shahara. It's not just the pasuk b'chol koich. And number two also explains as Zoknish Yaakov Avinu, nor Yaakov Atzadik. Because it's not Yaakov Avinu, it's just for doing the right thing. The word Tzadik in the Rambam means doing the right thing, Vabir. For Rambam and Reish Hilchos Deis is verstandig. From the Rambam, the beginning of Hilchos Deis, it's understood as the Teuer Tzadik, mit welchem der Rambam benutzt sich bei Sifra Yad. When he describes, the Rambam describes a tzaddik in the book of Yad, it doesn't mean someone who does just a perfection mitzvah. Nor der was fühlt sich k'fi hadin v'achiv, but somebody who conducts himself according to the law and obligation. Wer bringt dort in the psukim benegeyem midois v'han hagoisah. He brings there how persons measure in his conduct. Ader was gate in derech hayishora he made the beinuris. The one who goes in the right way, the straight path, that's the middle way. Verter beloshna posik, in the posik ongerufun tzadik. The Torah calls him a tzadik. Tzadik doesn't mean exception. It just means going in the right path. Und der was is medagdik al atzmai beyoser. one who is very careful about himself and very strict on himself, he goes beyond the level of the law. Werd angerufen Chassid, is called a Chassid. So when you say a tzaddik over here, we're not describing Avram as righteous. Das sagt der Rambam. As the Anhoge von Yaakov Laved b'chol koiche is not given an Inyan for Midas Chasidus Chulu. This that Yaakov worked for Lavan with all koiche was not a measure of Chasidus. Anhoge Yuchedes. It wasn't something special. Even to call him Yaakov our father would make him unique. He says no. That's a tzaddik, the right way. Every worker for the work of the balabais. So that's why the Rambam means to bring Yaakov as an example of the righteous way, the right way of doing things. And that the pay comes here and now, not in the future, because this is pay not for Chassidus, not for working. This is the pay for doing your obligation. And if you did your obligation, you got schar zois, that's what got paid. So far, this whole Rambam's chiddush that the Rebbe learns here, why the Rambam is using these words and brings down the tzaddik, and is all, and the Alter Rebbe quotes this Rambam. This is all part of the Rambam's explanation, which is also in the Alter Rebbe. The difference where we part company with the Rebbe says Vov now is that whether there is actually a distinction between working b'chol koichi or b'koyach. Even though they're both mandatory, and the Rebbe just pointed out that even when it says b'chol koichi from Yaakov, that's the standard. But the question is that standard an additional, or that's the standard? In other words, according to the Rambam, the Rebbe will explain, yes, you have to work b'koichi. That's one standard. And if you don't do b'koichi, then you're lacking, the work is not the full work. Then the Rambam adds, not only b'koichi, you have to work b'chol koichi. And that too would impact the actual promise to work the actual work to the other person. But according to the Alter Rebbe, there's just one obligation, working with all the koichi, and there's not additional obligation. Let's look in Oizvav. Der Chidush Gufa, this novelty, as der Chiv Lavid B'chol Koichi, is verbunden nicht nur mit der Klolus dicker Namonos von Poil. That to work B'chol Koichi is not just the general trustworthiness that a Poil needs to do, trustworthy to Hashem, nor mit the Meloche was tut for the Valabais, but as the Rambam, we've just explained what the Rambam is coming to tell you, that this is part of your work. Can we learn of Tzurifanim, but there's still two possibilities, the way the Rambam learns and the way the Alter Rebbe learns. Ein Eifen is, one way to say it is, Ados is verbundun mit kuf ha-melocha, that this is part of the job, and if you don't do that, you're actually going to be stealing. Aber das is an inyan noisef of dem etzem melocha lebal habayis. Yes, it's your obligation. It's part of the job. But there is addition. There is the job, and then addition to the job. It's an additional obligation. So the job itself doesn't require b'chol koichi. The job itself, in addition to the job itself, there's another obligation to the balabais. It would be still the balabais, but it's a second step. That's the view of the Rambam. Was voneinander der Aloches bescheiches zu Gesel Malachte Shala Balabais in Sebishun der Aloche. He separates the laws as stealing from the Balabos. First, he writes in Sebishun der Aloche two separate Aloches. So there's two separate things. In der erster Aloche sagt die Dinim von in Apoel Rashoy Lasis Malachte Balaylo Chulu Mipnei Gesel Malachte Shala Balabais. You can't do it at nighttime because this would be stealing from the balabais. Shalitoshos koiche. V'layasam locha b'koich is not going to do locha b'koich. In the Rambam, we see the very simple level of not doing b'koyach. You'd be stealing from the balabais. That's even before the Rambam goes through kishem shemuzar in the second halacha. And in der halacha shelachar ze hektaron a second additional obligation. Kiderech shemuzar balabais ligs scharoni. Even though we already said that he can't steal. But here, so here in this additional level that he's saying that besides stealing from the time of the balabais, there's something more about stealing by the balabais when he doesn't work in bechol koiche. So this is going to be bechol koiche. Valoit shitas harambam seine das zwei besondere gedorim. According to the view of the Rambam, these are two separate definitions. Ein chiyuv as the poil dav tom melocha bekoyach. There's one that has to do bekoyach, or else you're stealing from the balabais. Una bazunder chiyuv ledagde kal atzmei bizman chulu v'chein chayiv lavid bechol koyach, with all your koyach. So what's the difference between bekoyach and bechol koyach? So bekoyach, not to be goisel the balabais, we learned in the first halacha. But bechol koyach we're learning in the second halacha. What's the difference to working bekoyach and bechol koyach? And this is all part of the melacha of the balabais. Those was darf tun melacha bekoyach. What he needs to do it with strength is an inyan and etzem hamelacha. That's the work. A work without strength is not work. B'shas is felt melacha bekoyach, felt nachalesh melacha. If you're not doing it with strength, it's not really work. You're not doing it with the koyach, then you're lacking, the melacha is lacking. To work with all you, it's a chiyuv for the balabais, yeah, it's not mishur sadin. But that's not going to say that the melacha is lacking. Melacha is there. It's not while on them is nito together for melacha. It's not that if you don't do b'chol koicha, you're not doing work. No. But das ist verbunden mit der Hischayvus Protis, but that has a tied to this specific obligation from the poil to the balabayis Proti, from the worker to the specific balabais, which means it can be considered work, but I undertook the work from you, from this part, means that I am responsible to work b'chol koichi. That's my obligation. It may not be lacking. And the Rambam, it's two things. One thing is not to do melacha. That'll be one guess. Other thing would be not to do melacha b'chol koichi, which is also guess. Using a little bit different style. Melacha b'koyach stam, if you're just doing melacha b'koyach, is verbunden mit der Hefze von der Melacha. That's the object, it's not Melacha. Und der Chiv lavet b'chol koiche is b'shaychs l'gavra. That is as it pertains to the person. It's an obligation from the person to the balabais. Lavet b'chol koiche. Und der Chiv is b'shaychs l'gavra, zwischen dem Poil und dem balabais, between the worker and the balabais. Was a Poil is good for kon and the balabais. A Poil, a worker, his body is acquired to the balabos. Signon acher ktsas. Melocha bikoyach stam without bechol koyach is verbunden mit der Hefze von Melocha. That's tied to the object of Melocha. Und der Chiv lavid bechol koychoy is b'shayches la gavra. That is relates to the person. Zwischen dem Poil und dem Balabais. That you have to, the person has to work for the Balabais. Vasapoil is gufe konu the Balabais. His body is owned by the Balabais. So that's his obligation, but it's not in the Melacha itself. So this is in the Rambam, dividing it into two halachas. Mashenkin, like the Alter Rebbe, there's no two things. Seine da nicht zwei besondere Halachas. There's not two separate halachas. Melacha stam und melacha b'chol koiche. Stam melacha b'chol koiche, nor es ist ein halacha. Melacha b'koyach und melacha b'chol koiche. Seine nicht kein zwei gedorim. There are no two definitions. Together melacha b'chlal, to have one definition, und not zwei together, was ist verbunden mit der Ischaive, and another one which is tied to the obligation, v'shekonu, that he's acquired, hapoyel to the balabais proti, for this balabais, so that's his obligation. So the first one, it's lacking malacha, and here it's obligation. No. No, she's ein geder, alt is verbunden mit malachas balabais. It's all tied to the work of the balabais. Und der Far bringt der Alte Rebbe die Dinim. And that's why the Alte Rebbe brings these halachas von ein Apoel Rishoi v'chulu als Hemshech to the Hagdama. He brings it all as a continuation to the introduction. Ukederech shebalabais muzer chulu. Kacha oni muzer shelo yivot malachas balabais. Just like the owner has to be careful, so the poor person has to be careful. Chayv l'dagdik alatzme bezman, v'chein chayv lavet b'chol koichai. All in one b'chol koichai chulo. Lefikoch ein apoel. Then he continues, and therefore ein apoel rashoyi, because taking away some of the koyach or not the koyach, there's no difference. It's all together. So the Rambam, according to the Alter Rebbe, this is all a one result of having to work for the balabais means that you have to work b'chol koichai and not koyach and then b'chol koichai like in the Rambam. Zayin, api hanal yesh levayer gamkin kama shinuim kalim. Can also explain several small changes, and one can say no big deal, but knowing how the Alter Rebbe's words are precise, you can fit it in with this explanation. In Loshen Admor Hazok and Legabe Loshen Rambam, the way that Alter Rebbe writes it, in compared to the Rambam, was Afal Piaz L'Chayre Zan is a Colin. Although these are very light changes, is Ober Api HaYedua Goydel Hadik from L'Shoina Hazov and Alter Rebbe. As we know, the great precise language of the golden tongue of the Alter Rebbe, ubefrat as is thereby mishane from Loshen Rambam, especially that he changes from the language of the Rambam, is yesh loymar. So we can say that these small changes also change the content. Aleph. In the Soif from the Erster Halacha, in the end of the first Halacha of the Rambam, for the Rambam is mavayir dem tam from the Dinim, where he explains the reasons for the reason ein apoil rashoy lasis malachto balay lochulu mariva misagevatzme, not to do work at nighttime, not to starve himself, not to pain himself. Zokter mipnei gezel malachto shel bal habayis, because he is stealing the work of the bal habayis. Shadet toshash koicha betechlesh daitoi, his power is weak, his mind is weakened. Is not going to do work with koyach. That says in the Rambam. The Alter Rebbe is over thereby mishane. The Alter Rebbe changes. Is mashmit diverte mipnei gezel malachti shel balabais. When the Alter Rebbe brings down this halachas, he doesn't say because you're stealing the mlach de balabais. Anstatt v'loy yase, instead of saying he won't do zokter v'loy yuchalas, he won't be able to do. Anstatt melacha is the Alter Rebbe Moses melachas balabais, not melacha balabais. Pianav yeshleimer. So based on the above, we can say what's the difference. Leutner Rambam is the chesaron do. What's lacking here was v'loy yase melacha bekayach. He's not going to do melacha. The general, you can't have melacha if it's not done b'koyach. As felt in etzem shei melacha. In the river, gleich wie der Odom stellt sich in a matzav. As soon as the person places himself in a situation, was v'lo yasim melacha b'koyach, he won't be able to do melacha b'koyach when he's not sleeping, when he's hungry. is das in Geder from Gezel Melachte Shal Balabais. At that point, he's already stealing the Melacha the Balabais because he can't do this. The Melacha is affected. Weil is nicht treu zu sein Apoil. Sein Melacha is nicht kein Melacha. Your work, you're immediately impacted because that impacts the actual malacha. So right away, as soon as you starve yourself or you don't do all the work, then you're not long apoil. So you already gezel malachta. Mashenkin leit Rebbe, as opposed according to the Rebbe, is the chesorim v'lo yuchel is malachas balabais b'koyach. It's not that the malacha is not. Malacha is good. You won't be able to work for the balabais. Al zayin is chayiv kinyan to balabais because your obligation and your acquisition of balabais. So it's your obligation, not something in the malacha. Kommt ois as der is zu lasis malacha balayla chulu k'yetzebay. So at that point, is nit begeder gzelis malachta shalabais. So balabais, that's not stealing because that doesn't take you away, make you not a worker. Nor does is not a gram. So called the lo yuchal lasis malachta lechas balabais b'koyach. You won't be able to. That's not stealing yet. As the noch, when a beton lechas balabais, but does not kennen beton very much the boy, he won't be able to do it properly because he is already he's tired. But it's not that that is already the gezela. The gezela starts when he can't do it later on. He won't be able to. But according to the Rambam, is v'lo already because at that point he's impacting his ability of malacha. Base in the Raya from Yaakov and Meloshna Rambam, when we bring it says lefikach noch tal schar zeus. The Alter Rebbe sagt lefikach noch tal schoroi. Schar zeus is schoroi. What leutner Rambam is the schar van evet sein bechol koichoi. An inyan neusef auf dem schar auf der etze melocha la balabais. That's an additional schar of the melocha la balabais. Der schar is takke verbunden mit Gufa Melocha, genau so Sivdalen, is takke for the work, aber because they does an inyan neuse verwetzen Melocha. As we explained before, according to the Rambam, it's addition to the Melocha itself. Therefore is the Rambam medayik, lefikach not al schar zois. This, their spezielle schar of Aveda B'chol Koichoi. Because Aveda B'chol Koichoi, as we learned before, is two steps. There's Aveda B'koich, Aveda B'chol Koichoi. His Taka has to do both of them, but Aveda B'koich takes away from the Melacha. Aveda B'chol Koichoi is the obligation from the worker to the Bal HaBayis, and Schar Zois he gets for this extra work for the B'chol Koichoi. Mashenkin, the Alter Rebbe is Matgish, Lefikach Notel Schoroi, not Scharzoi, Schoroi, weil the Shitose is nicht, es does nicht kein zwei besondere Sachen. It's not two separate matters. It's not Aveda Stam and Aveda B'chol Koichoi. There's no two plain work and Aveda with all your power. But Aveda B'chol Koichoi is ein Geder mit Guf HaMelacha. To work with all your power is one defined together with the Melacha itself as Satut LaBalabais. Und der Riber, and therefore, where der Schar of Aveda B'chol Koichoi Nichlal in Schar Vedose. That's why the pay for working with all your koyach included in Schar Vedose. That's the regular Aveda. Not all Schar is Tam and not Schar Zois. So the Rebbe explains why the Rambam uses Schar Zois because that's an extra step of B'chol Koichoi, more than koyach. According to the Rambam, there's only one step. That's why he is B'chol Schare. And also, the Rambam, three Lashonis that Rebbe pointed out, Lo Yuchal, the Balabais is because over there the Chesor begins as soon as you're up at night and everything else because you're not a worker then. But according to the Alter Rebbe, it's only a cause that later on you won't be able to work. Ches. They rough them. So what's the lesson in Avodah Sodom? Was hinten seinen doch Poyalim Yidden are workers. Was darfen to malacha far balabayis HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They need to do work of the balabayis, which is Hashem, Kadosh Baruch Hu. Der Tam for was dem Chiyuv lavet b'chol koicha lernt man up von Avodas Yaakov beveis loven harami in Choron. The reason why are we learning the obligation to work with all your koyach from Yaakov Avinu's work in the house of Loven Arami in Choron is der Fall, weil die Meloche was darf ton fahren obersten b'chol koicha. Because the fact that a Yid, this work that a Yid needs to do for Hashem with all of his strength, is bedoimet to Avodas Yaakov Beveis Lavan. That's similar to Yaakov's service in the house of Lavan. Ki Yedua, as it's known, is the Avodah for Yaakov Beveis Lavan given nit in the Dalet Ames shall Beis Hamedrash shall Shem Be'er. His work in the house of Lavan was not in the 4 cubits of the Beis Hamedrash of Shem Be'er. Oder afile where is given in Eretz Yisrael based of Yitzchak, or even as it was in his father's house in Yitzchak's house. Was demult is given, then it was sein Avodah als in Olam HaKedusha. Everything was in the world of holiness. That's Shem Ba'ever, Olam HaKedusha. That's not where Yaakov had to work. Nor sein Avodah dort is given b'choron. It wasn't choron. Charein afshal mokim b'olam. That word where Hashem's anger is in the world, the place where God is angry on. To transfer, to make the world into a dwelling place for him, blessed. Und al derech ze besteht die Iden von jeden, die Avodah von jeden Iden as a poil shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Similar consists the Avodah of every Yid as a worker of Hashem. Those was an Neshama din dem Ebersten. When sie is noch in Elam Eselyonim, the fact that the soul serves Hashem when it's in the upper worlds, before it descends below and dresses itself up in a body. But when you're standing before Hashem, it's a very elevated level of service. Sein Seichel, Verstand and Gettlichkeit. Both intellectually, your understanding godliness, also emotionally, your Avas Hashem, Yiras Hashem, the love and the fear of Hashem. Aber das ist als ihr Avodah. This is all the Neshama's Avodah. Dafke wenn the Neshama kommt herab in Olam Hazagashmi. It is specifically when the soul comes down in this physical world. Und dort Gufa bleibt nicht der Odem verschlossen Tomit. And there in this world, the person doesn't always remain closed up. Not in the Dal Damnus Torah would feel only in the 4 cubits of Torah and Davening. But is the Chesik in Avedis Abirurim. But rather he occupies himself in the service of sorting out if zu machen die Tachtonim, shein Tachte Lamate Mene, to make the lower ones, those lower ones that there's nothing lower than it, Adira Lo Yisbarach, to make them a dwelling place for him, blessed. Do izer apoil shalakol b'ad Kadosh Baruch Hu. Here, he becomes a worker of the Eberster. Das is malachte shal balabayis. This is the work of Hashem. That's not your own work. That's not the work of yourself. Now you're having the work of Hashem to make a change in the world. When you're working l'maylo, it's your service to Hashem. Here you're working to make the works of Hashem. Test. One of them is the limud from Yaakov. And here we learn from Yaakov. You have to do with all your strength. Not only that you have to be careful in time, because if you are going to waste a little here, a little there, you make a calculation as es macht nicht zu ablegen the melechas balabais, that it doesn't matter to delay the work of the balabais mat a little bit. Und derweil reingabt in yonim, and in the meantime to grab hold of those aspects was eine verbunden mit sein shlemus. He'll fill it up with that things that are filled with his own wholesomeness. He'll fill his stomach with Torah. He'll have more understanding in Torah. Similar. das Goyim sein, also Moitzi Kol Hayoim, then this will spend all day. The whole day that we have to do, it'll be with the seat. You won't do it. No, noch but it's even more than that. Not only to capture every moment. You have to invest all the powers of your soul. You may think, B'shas mi is noch in the Dal Dam Shel Torah Utfila. When you're in the 4 cubits of learning and davening, that's your service is tied to your power of intellect. Learning Torah mit Avona Vasoga, he is to learn Torah with understanding and grasp, or mit seiner Midas, with his emotion. That's the service davening. So when he's davening, when he's learning, so then when you're davening and you're learning, you have to invest your intellect and your emotion. When you're actually exiting, you go out to the outside. The work is to turn the world into a dwelling place for Hashem. Over there, mainly you got to do with your power of doing. It only involves accepting the yoke. Just you don't have to invest your talents, your emotions, your intellect. If that means the lesson is as in the Avodah of Machen Direle Yisbarach B'Tachtoni. But this Avodah to make Hashem a dwelling place in the lower is Chayiv Lavid B'Chol Koichai. You have to work with all your power. Nit nor b'Tekoiches Tachtonim Shaloi. Not only with your lower powers, nor with B'Tekoiches Pnim Shaloi. Also with your inner powers, like Midas, your power of intellect, motion. You should invest in your avodah and the outside. Even to the extent to also involve your surrounding koiches, which is your power of will and power of pleasure. So you think, okay, maybe this is an exceptional mitzvah doing this in the perfect way. Because to make the dwelling place what is mainly important, we just need you to act. Of them hotman the heroes, now we have the lesson. As os, as es, as is a chiyuv gomer, that it's a complete obligation, total obligation. But on them hastes gesel. Without it, it's called stealing. Bittul malachtas balabais. You are wasting the work of the balabais, not doing it properly. The shame meloche from asiyas didalayim is what b'tachtonim. Just to call it meloche of making the b'tachtonim can efshir zayin afilu v'metut blois mit koich asiyah. That may be only if you do it with the koich asiyah. That will be if you follow, I guess, the Alter Rebbe's view that it's called a Sheikh Melocha. But the Rambam doesn't even call it Melocha. I think the Rebbe is hinting that. Aber als Meleches Balabais, muss da wird sein bechol koiche. But to be bechol Meleches Balabais, to do for the Balabos, it needs to be bechol koiches. Vayidin zayin nirger b'chol kuloi. Vayidin must feel in all entirety as calling Yonah is to durchführen the shlichus from the Meibersten. That this whole aspect of a Yid is to fulfill, make a dwelling place for Hashem b'tachtonim. Und als poil is gufe konetzu balabai, and being a worker, your body is acquired to Hashem's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, tuter malachas balabais b'chol koichai. He does the work of the balabais of the master with all of his power. Durch dem was Ayid fir durch sein melacha. B'chol koichas nafshei. Through this, that Ayid fills his entire powers of his soul with all of his soul is a neitel schorei ab b'olam hazeh. Then you get the rewards in this world. Bis in an Eufen Vayeitzei ish moed moed. Baseball moed. This is moed moed very very, which is blikbul hamiti, truly infinite. Dafke durch der Avoide in Olam Hazeh nennt man the moed hamiti. Dafke through this world nennt man the moed hamiti. So the Rebbe related this ideas that we discussed, that you have to work b'chol koichi, that this applies to the work that you have to do outside in Lovan. That's, we learn it from Lovan in the working in the Choron, working in the outside, that over there you have to do it with all of the koyach. And the Rebbe, basically, to sum up in the Sikha, explained the difference between the Alter Rebbe's view and changed it from the Rambam. Now, the Rambam believes that not working b'koyach is a lack in the malacha. Working b'chol koycha is an extra obligation from the worker to the Bal Habayis, and according to the Alter Rebbe, it's all one connected piece. And the Rebbe explained what the Rambam is trying to clarify, that this working b'chol koycha b'chlal is not just an extra for Hashem, that you're being an honest person, but this is part of the Melacha, and the Vayeitzei ish moed moed not l'schar, whether Zois or Schorei, that's the difference between the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam, but this is all his pay over here, because that's what they made up, and that's why it's Tzaddik doing the right thing. This is all Sichos Shabbos Parashat Vayeitzei, Tov Shin Yud Tes.